Good morning, everyone. I'm Farah Nasser, and I'm so pleased to be part of the team bringing you this year's RTDNA Canada Conference. And good early morning to those of you joining us from the West Coast. We have so many great panels for you today. We have lots of opportunities for you to ask questions to our experts and our panelists. And I know most of you are working journalists watching, so if you can't watch all of our discussions live today, we're going to be making them available on the RTDNA Canada website. But before we begin, I want to start the day with a land acknowledgement. Now, these few words spoken at gatherings just like this can provoke thought and reflection about colonialism, and how to engage in reconciliation in a more meaningful way. I'm situated in Toronto, and I want to acknowledge that I am located on the ancestral territories of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and currently the Haudenosaunee peoples, and since 1805, the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. The territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And as we reflect on the tragic events of the past week, a reminder that subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And with that, although our conference is sadly virtual this year, we'll begin as we always do with a message from the president of RTDNA Canada. Here with words of welcome is Fiona Conway.
Good morning. Here we are 1 year later and we're still in varying degrees of lockdown. It's an understatement to say it's been a hard year, so I thank you all for joining us today. We have a lot of exciting panels planned, and I'm really pleased that we've made this conference free and available to everyone. Well, it's not actually free. We are here thanks to all of our sponsors, CTV News, Global News, CBC News, and Rogers City TV. Also, Canadian Press, Google, DeGiro, and Narcity. Thank you all for your continued support. And now just a quick word from USA RTDNA Executive Director, Dan Shelley.
Greetings from RTDNA US. I'm Dan Shelley, Executive Director of RTDNA US, and I'd like to add my welcome to this year's RTDNA Canada National Conference. I usually travel throughout North America and around the world each year to preach the gospel of press freedom and journalism ethics, but this event is always one of my favorites. I can't wait until we're all able to gather again in person. The bond between RTDNA Canada and RTDNA US is long and strong. The challenges broadcast and digital journalists face in Canada are quite similar to those we face in America. The theme of this conference, Reckoning and Recovery, is one with which I and your other colleagues to the South have also been coping for these past 16 months. Despite the pandemic, despite the trauma many of us have felt during the past 16 months, embracing the reawakening surrounding the need to have greater diversity, equity, and inclusion in our newsrooms and in our coverage, RTDNA is and always will be there for you. In the US, I've been fighting for more press freedom, against obstructionist efforts targeting press freedom, and against acts of violence targeting journalists. I am immensely proud that throughout all of these challenges, journalists in Canada and the United States have persevered. We have served our communities and our nations by seeking and reporting the truth without fear or favor, despite the obstacles. You will learn a lot at this conference. Take it back to your newsrooms, whether they be virtual or in person. Challenge yourself and your colleagues to perform what I call flagrant acts of responsible journalism. You owe the people of Canada nothing less. Good day and good luck.
Before we get to the main event this morning, our annual Bear Pit with Canada's network news leaders, which I know many of you are looking forward to, our friends at Ipsos have once again agreed to set the stage by taking the pulse of Canadians on their habits and attitudes on news. News, in what we can all agree, has been an unprecedented time. So questions like, where are people getting their news? What do they expect from that news? And ultimately, do they trust us? RTDNA Conference Co-Chair Beatrice Politi now speaking with Ipsos CEO Darrell Bricker.
Thanks so much. I'm Beatrice Politi. We have, hopefully, anyway, at this point, made most of our way through this global pandemic. It has challenged how we live in every aspect. And it has also challenged the work that we do. We've had to change everything about what we do. Every year, we ask Ipsos to give us a sense of how news is consumed, how it's perceived, where Canadians get their news, and what's important to them when it comes to news. And there is something that is essential to everything that we do: trust. And that was one of the main themes this morning. We have Ipsos CEO Darrell Bricker to speak to us today about the polling that he has done for the RTDNA for this year. Welcome, Darrell. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Well, thanks for having me back, Beatrice. This is always a great opportunity to speak to the media every year about these survey results, and we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the things I want to talk about first is that the way that this polling has been framed is really trust in news. And obviously, since 2020, we have been in a crisis that I think for most of us in our lifetimes we've never actually experienced. It's a worldwide crisis. And in times like those, we turn to political leaders, in this case to medical experts and scientists for leadership. Historically speaking, I wanted to start with a context question. When it comes to trust, in times like these, what is the general pattern when it comes to trust in leadership and media in a crisis like this?
Well, we certainly see in our polling, and this is a worldwide phenomenon, when things go bad, the public very quickly turns to the media for information. And what we saw in this pandemic was really a good example of it. We saw trust go way up, not only consumption go way up of media, but trust go way up. But things change over time. Just as the pandemic has changed, so have trust patterns.
So one of the things I want to do is now pull up the slide that has to do with this. Trust in traditional news media has declined. So if you take a look at that, you'll see that we've got 65% in 2018. In 2019, it looked pretty good, 72%, and now we're back down. We didn't do the polling last year because of the pandemic. So what do these numbers tell us about what's been going on with trust in the media?
Well, it's been reasonably stable over time, and whatever peak that we saw as a result of the pandemic, if we would have done the poll in 2020, you would have seen the numbers probably go up higher than 72. We certainly saw it in international polling on the media. But what's happened is it's come back down to more typical levels, something like what we saw back in 2018.
So when you say more typical levels, and let's bring Darrell back up, is this a temporary lull? Is this something that the media in general should be worried about, or is this more of a situational issue where we're at a certain point in the pandemic and a lot has been said and unsaid and it's been a time of uncertainty?
Well, I think that there's a couple of things to point to here, Beatrice. One of them is what's been happening. So what's happened is we've gone from media being a provider of information now to more of a provider of commentary. And when you move past from information to commentary, that's when you start to see trust wane a little bit. I'd also say that more of the commentary these days has been about the politics around what's been going on with COVID and the management of the pandemic. And when we move back into a political environment, that's where you start to see trust get frayed a little bit. But the other thing here is it's all relative. If we put up, for example, trust in industry numbers, across other types of industries, or put up public institution trust numbers, trust in politician numbers, those numbers are worse than what you're seeing for the media. That doesn't mean that it's great that you're doing better than groups that aren't doing very well at all, but it does mean that there's kind of a relative positioning here where you see trust in everything basically declining over time.
And I think, too, with some of the polling that had been done in the past that Ipsos has done, in the beginning of the pandemic, the approval for federal and provincial and local leadership was actually quite high.
Yeah, we saw premiers, for example, like Doug Ford in Ontario, get numbers that he's never seen. I saw actually the highest level of approval I've ever seen for a political leader on any poll was 98% for Francois Legault in Quebec. So, out of this world approval levels that were happening, because people, as more than just saying that they trusted them, they wanted to trust them. So it was some of this was about hope as opposed to actual performance. So there was a real desire to see political institutions perform well, and some of that spilled over onto the media too, where people wanted to see the media doing the job that they assumed that the media was doing. And early on in the pandemic, certainly the media numbers were really strong, not just in Canada, but globally.
So here's another thing. As we prepare to pull up the next trust, which is called, next slide, which is called Decline in Trust is Significant and Widespread, it seems to me that the level of trust depends on which type of media it is that we're talking about. So broadcast news, for example, and once we bring up the slide, you'll be able to see it on your screen as well. There it is. Broadcast news, sure, there's a little bit less trust than in 2019, but it's not that big a spread, whereas with print and talk radio, they show the biggest dip in trust, so to speak, with a 9-point difference. So what is the story behind those numbers? Is broadcast news really more ahead of print and news radio, or does it have to do with the situational consumption of those types of media, given that we've all been at home for so long?
Right. I think situational consumption is actually a pretty good way of putting it, Beatrice. I think that television's obviously more accessible to us in our homes, where most of us have been stuck. If you read the newspaper, for example, when you were finding on your way to work, or you were reading it at work, that chain was disrupted. And talk radio, people tend to go for the controversy and the back and forth and the discussion that happens in talk radio, and it's less about specific information. So I think through the course of this, the primary place that people go for immediate information tends to still be broadcast TV, and we've seen that in other circumstances as well. For example, if there's a political crisis, if there's a big news event, the first place that people tend to turn to is to television news.
Fantastic. It also, if we bring Darrell back up, it also appears that despite this time of common crisis, where all of us were so hungry for information, we were hungry for answers, we were hungry for certainty in a time when really no one had any certainty, it seems that Canadians are actually accessing fewer media sources overall, which this may be where we're at in the pandemic. Maybe at the beginning it wasn't like this. But if we could bring up the next slide, Canadians are accessing fewer media sources. And you can see that there's two colors of circles there. If you look to the darker blue circle, that's back in 2019. And every single one of those little green circles reflecting now is to the left, so fewer media sources. So what here is the thing that we should be paying attention to? What is actually significant in your view?
Well, I think first of all that everybody's kind of hurting a little bit. But even things like, for example, traditional print newspapers, well, where are people going? Well, they're going for newspaper information to the newspaper's website. And I think that the important thing to take a look at in all of this is that I would say the discrepancy between what we would consider to be non-traditional sources of media and more traditional sources of media, it really depends as much on the source as it does on the actual mechanism for getting access to the media. And I think newspapers are a good example of that. I mean, people are substituting the website of the newspaper for what's happening in print newspapers. Facebook, obviously it's come back, but people are still accessing social media in general. So it's maybe a little bit more platform agnostic. One thing that I think is always interesting to talk about to journalists is the place of Twitter in all of this. There's an obsession, I think, in journalism in general. I mean, if you want to run into a reporter or somebody in the media, you run into them on Twitter. But it's of the things that we looked at in terms of places where people go to get primary information, access to media sources. Even though that's where the reporters are, that's not where the public is.
Can we talk a little bit more about Facebook? It looks like there's quite a difference there, and that surprises me a little bit, considering that I would imagine that print and broadcast would do a lot worse than Facebook in a time when we're all connected virtually. What's behind that? Well,
what we're finding with the big social media platforms, Facebook being a very good representation of it, is there's been a lot of controversy over the space of the last couple of years, actually going back to the 2016 election in the United States, but also other political events that have happened in various places. And I think that what's happening in the public is they're no longer perceiving it to be a source of neutral information. It's no longer fitting in the place that you would describe as media, the way as comfortably as it was previously. I think all sorts of issues related to things like, for example, fake news or the spawning of certain types of political movements through that mechanism has had an effect, I would say, on its brand. And you don't have to listen to me on this. You don't have to even look at these survey results. Look at what's been happening in the regulatory environment with Facebook, and look at the challenges that they've been facing over the last while. And it's happening in real time in the real world for them.
What's really interesting about this, too, is that the one time that the sort of green-colored circle is to the right is when people say they're not accessing any of these types of media sources. How much does this have to do simply with the situation that we're in? Are people tired of news? Are people burnt out from news? Are they just done?
Yeah, we are finding that there is a segment of the population that's pretty fatigued with everything that's related to what we're going through. We've seen this in everything from the percentage of people in Canada that are telling us that they're suffering from mental health issues as a result of this. We're seeing it in terms of substance abuse, which has gone up. And by the way, you don't have to just think that it's happening. When you go out and you ask people whether or not it is happening in their lives, it is happening. And people are getting worn out. They're having a difficult time dealing with this. And it stands to reason that turning off some of the sources of that anxiety might be a response. But still, I mean, you can see from this that the much larger numbers are still going out and seeking information. Maybe not in singular places like they were previously, but they're still engaged.
One of the things I do want to bring up is broadcast television news. There is a difference, but there isn't that much of a difference. And does that really I remember the beginning of the pandemic, we were all glued. Everything that people said on television was like an emergency communication, or so it felt. So has TV sort of, done a little bit better, potentially because it's the default in the way our leaders are reaching us?
Well, I think that there's an immediacy that's associated with TV, but also the fact that, exactly as you said, Beatrice, it's the methodology that our leaders have chosen to communicate with us. So, daily press conferences by the Prime Minister or public health officials or premiers in various provinces, people are watching them. And early on in the pandemic, they were watching them almost like emergency broadcasts. So it was literally, what am I going to learn in this particular moment that's going to help me decide tomorrow whether my kid can go to school, I can go to work, whether or not it's safe for me to go out shop, how I can find, toilet paper. I mean, there was an awful lot of primary information that people were getting from that immediate source, mainly because they could see their political leaders, who they saw as the authorities, speaking what they believed were facts about what was going on. That's declined over time, and you've even seen it in the behavior of the political leaders, where we're seeing less of them, except around really big announcements on doing daily press conferences. It's being pushed on to officials, and as a result of that, what's happened is the public's backed off of it.
All right, let's go to another part of our polling. Let's bring Darrell back up. We're now going to talk about news aggregators. The interesting thing about all this is, as people are consuming or looking to fewer media sources, perhaps engaging with certain media sources less than they used to, it seems to me, however, that more people, when they do go to find news, would rather go to a news aggregator site than the website of an actual mainstream media organization. If we can bring the slide up just for a couple of minutes as Darrell gives us context on this, or for about 30 seconds. So here we are. We've got 4% more people looking at news aggregators and 4% fewer versus 2019 looking at traditional news organizations. Is that something that we should be worried about at this point?
Well, I think the point here is that still 2-to-1, people prefer to go to the traditional news sites over the news aggregators. The news aggregators have a little bit of momentum, not a huge amount, I would say, over the space of the last 2 years, but obviously something worth watching. But Beatrice, when you and I and George talked about this survey a week or so ago, and we were talking about what we wanted to say during this discussion, diversity was part of the conversation that we were having. And I know we're going to be dealing directly with, I think, more of the immediate sense of diversity in just a couple of minutes. But it also applies to news sources and the way that people are picking up their information. There's a greater diversity of sources now in terms of how people are looking at it. And part of that diversity applies to news aggregators, which, as I said before, have some momentum here, but still the traditional news organizations and being direct sources of information are still the most prominent.
And as let's bring Darrell back up. And here's another thing that is interesting about trust is that it sometimes depends on what kind of story it is that we're telling in terms of where people feel their trust is in the media. So, for example, there's a difference between trust when it comes to covering Harry and Meghan, that debacle earlier this year, or the Nova Scotia shootings, or COVID-19, or the US presidential election. So, how should we interpret that? And let's bring up the slide so that people can see what the actual numbers say. So there you go. Give us a sense. Should we be confident in our COVID-19 coverage based on the findings that you've made here?
I think reasonably so. And as you get away from stories that mean less to people in terms of their day-to-day life, then obviously people are paying less attention. Like, so for example, Harry and Meghan, Canadians are not necessarily that interested in that story, although it got a lot of attention. Maybe there's certain segments of Canadians that are. But yeah, COVID-19 pandemic is clearly at the top of the list. And as I said before, it's really perceived more as almost like an emergency broadcast. I think one of the things that that you see in terms of public opinion on this is the more that it's covered as like a science story, and the more it's fact-based, and the more it's presented as a way of helping people get through this and for their day-to-day lives, it has more appeal. And as you sort of track down the list, you see political stories are less interesting to the public. So I think one of the things to be wary of in terms of news coverage is treating it like it's a political story. And I know there's a lot of politics around it, obviously, but those panel shows that you have on television, for example, where you've got 4 people barking at each other about something, I don't know that it's necessarily appropriate for this particular topic. On some of the other topics, obviously, but you can see that they have less appeal the further you go down the list. And the more that the conversation is really about that, less about reporting the facts and a lot of opinions.
All right, let's move now to, let's bring Darrell back up, and let's move now to diversity. It's obviously been an issue that we've been looking at from a multitude of areas and perspectives. So we asked Canadians what they thought about diversity in Canadian news media, and if we bring up that slide, Canadians want to hear from diverse voices. What we're seeing is that diverse voices are important for most Canadians at 76%, and it appears most Canadians, by that I mean a majority, more than a majority, agree with a number of different statements there, including the Canadian news media reflects the diversity of Canada. Canadian news media should be hiring more reporters of different backgrounds. We cover stories about racism, discrimination, and inclusivity well. How should we, as news media organizations, be reading these numbers?
Well, obviously, what they're saying here is clearly communicated in the statements. A more diverse group of representation on screen or in print or however the media is presenting itself is something that Canadians are looking for, particularly when you're looking at groups of the population that feel that they really have been underrepresented. So, for example, the BIPOC community and the LGBTQ2S plus community feel that they haven't necessarily been as well represented in terms of media presentation. But obviously this is an agenda item that we saw in the previous slide when we looked at how important the Black Lives Matter story and equity stories were for Canadians. There was a lot of learning that was going on over the space of the last 18 months. And I expect that what they're hoping is that some of the learning is going to say, hey, media, maybe you need to look at the people who are presenting this information, not just the people who are presenting it, but the way that particular stories are covered and what aspects of the news happen to get covered. There's at least an interest among Canadians to see something different from what they're getting today.
So there definitely is, if we bring Darrell back up, definitely a need for change. And let's delve a little bit deeper into that, because diversity can mean a number of different things, depending on how you ask the questions, so to speak. So there could be geographic and ethnic and gender diversity within media. So let's bring up that slide having to do with those topics. And as far as you're concerned, Darrell, when you look at these things, when you look at your findings, what should be the priority? It looks like amongst the general population, they're talking about news from more than sort of the big cities. Very, very close behind, more diversity across race or ethnicity in terms of the people who, deliver our news and the people who who are covered in that news, etc. So what should we take as media organizations? What direction should we take by looking at this?
Well, it's just understand that Canadians, when they're looking at what you're seeing, you may see it as what you're putting out there as diverse, but they don't. That's the thing. So yes, it's good to change the ethno-cultural backgrounds of some of the people that you have presenting, but if they're just presenting the same news over and over again, it still sounds like downtown if you live in Lethbridge.
Right.
And so diversity is actually diverse. It's not just looking at it from the perspective of ethno-racial backgrounds, people who happen to the visual identity of the people who are presenting the news. It's also about the topics and the point of view. You can see here more diversity across the political spectrum. 40% of Canadians think that. More than half of people who say that they would be willing to vote for the Conservative Party in the next election campaign, they feel that they're particularly not well represented in terms of what the media is putting out there. And remember, in the last election campaign, they actually won more votes than the Liberal Party won. So, you sit back and you say to yourself, well, there's certain elements that relate to the visual presence of the people that you have out there, or maybe the names that they see in the bylines, that also actually relate to their point of view and also the scope of what they decide to cover. This, I thought it was really interesting that the thing that popped out as the most important, granted by only 1 point, was more diversity across geography. Isn't that something we've been hearing forever in terms of Canadian politics and media? A need to get out there. And I would say increasingly, not just in small towns and rural areas or whatever, it's really in the suburbs and the expanding version of what the suburbs is, because that's the most rapidly growing part of the Canadian population. In fact, 90% of the Canadian population growth over the last 20 years has taken place in car commuting communities, and they don't see themselves very well necessarily in this news. So when you start thinking about who the readers are, who the viewers are, who the listeners are, it's not just what they look like, it's where they live and also what they think.
Yes. Let's bring Darrell back up. And so you've done all this polling for us. Thank you again. Let's talk about, if we look at the polling and what you've seen this year and what you've seen over the years, let's talk about what newsrooms should actually be doing with this. So let's go along the lines of the start, stop, continue, continuum. Let's start with what should newsrooms start doing?
I think, the first thing I would say is that understand the context in which we're living. So when people are thinking about tomorrow these days, they're literally thinking about Wednesday. There's a real sense of immediacy to everything that's happening right now. Thinking about what things are going to look like 5 years from now, or 3 years from now, or even a year from now is pretty far from the perspective of most of the public. They're looking for information that they can use today to plan their life tomorrow, or even today. They are really very, very focused on the pandemic and the results of the pandemic. So there, other issues are out there that are interesting, like politics or whatever, are very much secondary issues for the public right now, unless they play directly on what's going to be happening to them as a result of what we're going through in the pandemic. The next thing is, there's a lot of discussion about, future plans, building back better, different types of initiatives that are going to be taking place in the future. Interesting to discuss, but the public right now is in the middle of a day-to-day battle, and they haven't got a lot of mind space for that kind of conversation at the moment. Certain elite audiences obviously do, but the day-to-day activities of people are being very governed by what's happening in their as a result of this pandemic. So they want to know an awful lot about that, and then thinking about who the viewers are, who the readers are, who the listeners are, and what they're actually living through. I mean, how are they schooling their kids at home? Lots of people are out there dealing with issues that relate to things, for example, like mental health and challenges are associated with struggling through this pandemic, not being able to see their families and that kind of thing. Issues that relate to people who aren't that privileged group of the population who haven't experienced any pay cutbacks and are able to work at home, like we're presenting this today. Well, there's an awful lot of people in the Canadian economy who aren't doing that today, who really are struggling and really are suffering, and they want some sense of what their future is going to look like when we come out of this. So I think that trying to understand how Canada is working its way through this and making sure that whatever you're presenting speaks directly to it in a really immediate way, I think is the thing to start.
All right. What should we stop doing?
I think the more elite types of conversations that would be very friendly at the local, coffee bar in downtown Toronto are not necessarily things that are going to appeal to a wider audience of Canadians. And I would say that, one of the things that I talk to journalists a fair amount about is start trying to understand better the demographic composition of the country. The median age of a Canadian today is 41. The fastest growing part of our population are people who are living in the suburbs. Most of the population are not dealing with issues relating to things like education as much as they used to be. They're dealing with issues that relate to elder care and taking care of parents. The demographic composition of the country is changing dramatically. We're the most diverse population. I mean, over 20% of the Canadian population is foreign born, was born in a country in which they don't, they're living in Canada today, but they were born in another country. What are we doing to speak to them? And they're the fastest growing population basically in our suburbs. It used to be that people who were new to Canada moved downtown. They don't anymore. They move to our suburban areas. So what is the media doing to speak to that population? You can see things on air are changing. The stories that are being covered are changing to reflect that, but maybe moving a bit faster, at least as fast as the demography is moving. Would probably you'd be in a good place if you could connect with that group of new Canadians.
And when it comes to what we should continue doing, if there's one thing we should continue doing, what would that be?
One of the most trusted institutions in Canada continues to be the Canadian media. Yes, it's been shaken, just like every institution has been shaken by a whole series of forces that are too extensive to go into just in today's conversation. But understanding the importance of trust to being able to continue to go into Canadians' homes, to go into Canadians' minds, how important maintaining a fact-based way of looking at things to the extent that it can be fact-based. And really trying to communicate the truth to Canadians is ultimately what builds trust. It's that conversation that goes back and forth where they know that they can go to you to get the truth about what's happening, and it's not about spin, it's not about commentary, but it's actually about the facts. And to the extent that commentary is commentary, it's for the purposes of not, some person appearing on air just to talk through the 5-party spin lines and they've been given by the Premier's office or the Prime Minister's office. And so they're actually providing commentary that can help people interpret what's going on. And so, to the extent that you can put that knowledge and experience and information together and drive it with facts is where trust comes from. So I think that the thing that the media has done a great job of over the years is obviously maintaining a position of trust with Canadians where a lot of other institutions have not done as well. So making sure that you do that, but also understand how fragile it is and understand that that's the place that you hold for Canadians. And if it's jeopardized at all, those readership numbers that are slowly coming down, those viewership numbers that are slowly coming down will accelerate even faster.
Thank you so much, Darrell, for all those insights. And before we go, because we've run out of time, we actually have a little surprise, bit of an announcement from RTDNA Canada, brought to you by a familiar face, the one, the only past conference co-chair, George Brown. So let's take a look.
Darrell, on behalf of RTDNA Canada, I would like to present to you and Ipsos Public Affairs Canada the Bill Hutton Award of Excellence.
Oh, wow.
This is an award named after RTDNA Canada's first president and is presented to those who have shown a true commitment to the RTDNA and the betterment of broadcast journalism in Canada. Ipsos, yourself, and of course Sean Simpson have generously provided our annual convention with groundbreaking polling and analysis on the state of the public's trust of our journalistic institutions, along with other findings relevant to our industry. Congratulations, and again we thank you for your valuable contributions and hope to continue this relationship for many years to come.
Well, I was just going to say, mind blown. I'm so humbled, and on behalf of Ipsos and all my colleagues in Ipsos Public Affairs and Ipsos generally here in Canada, we're thrilled to accept this award. So thank you very, very much. And yes, you can count on us going forward. And we look at continuing to explore these questions with our friends at RTDNA. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Darrell, and congratulations. I know that we've enjoyed a very long relationship with you at RTDNA, and I enjoyed a very long relationship with Ipsos as well at Global News. So thank you again, Darrell, for your insights, for being with us every year. And now we are off momentarily to the annual highlight of the conference, which is the Bear Pit.